Mr. President.
Senator of Connecticut.
We need a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in a 1793 letter to William Cabell Reeves, James Madison said this. He said, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department." A few years later, in another letter, this time to Thomas Jefferson as part of their famous correspondence, Madison expounded on that very simple superlative, naming the War Powers Clause in the Constitution as the most important. He said, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Our founding fathers didn't get everything right. They didn't see ahead of time that this chamber would be divided in two, Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other side, but they knew, having watched the course of human history, that executives, in their day, mostly all monarchs and kings, had all sorts of reason to drag their nation into war. Power often came from war. The funding that could be raised for war, the loyalty commanded by war, the glory that occasionally came to the leader, the ruler, through war and through conquest. There was great risk in war, but there was also great reward in war. And there was far too much of it in the era in which our Constitution was being formed. The purpose of the founders was to give the American people a voice in government, a revolutionary idea at the time, but it was also to order our government in a way that war would become less likely, would become less frequent. They imagined a world, this new America, in which peace would be the rule, not war, as it was at the time for the citizens of Europe who lived under the rule of kings, prone to war, incentivized to war, as James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson. And so this part of the Constitution, with more wisdom in it than any other part of the Constitution, according to James Madison, is this section of our founding document that says it is not up to the ruler, it is not up to the executive branch, it is up to the branch of government most connected to the people to decide whether we go to war, to require that there be a debate, a conversation that involves everyone in this nation, that requires, that necessitates a collective decision as to whether to put the brave soldiers of this country and the collective security of the nation at risk. And so we are here today because we still find wisdom in that clause of the Constitution. We still see great risk in moving into a world which we are quickly moving to, in which that clause that James Madison named as the supreme clause of the Constitution is dead letter, is dead letter. And that is the risk, because there are very few wars that are so planned, so far in advance, that there is time to come and have a month-long debate. Wars happen quickly, and they necessitate quick action according to the Constitution. Yes, we have always accepted that there has to be an exception, but a limited exception to that supreme clause in the Constitution. If there is an imminent attack against the United States, of course, the people of the United States want the ability of the President of the United States to respond to that imminent attack. But in the absence of an imminent attack, there is no exception. There is no ability to go around Congress. And in the case of the hostilities against Iran that the president began last weekend, there was no imminent threat against the United States. There was no army marching on this nation. There was no nuclear bomb that even existed that could be dropped on the United States or our soldiers in the region. And so it was required, it is required under the Constitution that the president come to Congress. If the president doesn't need to come to Congress to attack another nation preemptively, preventatively, absent an imminent threat, then that provision of the Constitution is dead letter, period, stop. And the most important piece of this document, according to our most revered founding father, is no longer operational. And if we lurch into a world in which any executive can send us to war without the participation of the American people, then we are in a world that our founding fathers could never have imagined. So I'm very glad to be on the floor today as a big fan of the wisdom of our founders to support Senator Kane's resolution. And I appreciate his consistency in bringing this question before us. I don't want to live in a world in which the greatest question that this country could envision, whether or not we send our brave men and women to fight on our behalf, is not a question that doesn't involve the collective conversation of this body and of the people of this nation. So I think it's an important resolution to debate here, and I hope my colleagues will support it. It doesn't really have to do with whether you think there is wisdom in this action or not, whether you think the president was right or wrong. This is an opportunity for us to stand up for our responsibility under the Constitution to be a co-equal branch in setting foreign policy. I have my thoughts on the wisdom of this action. I've stated that I think it's very dangerous when the President of the United States deliberately misleads the country about the efficacy of our military operations overseas or the threats presented to this country. It's unforgivable any time a president doesn't tell the truth, but it is especially unforgivable when the president doesn't tell the truth about national security intelligence. I know my colleagues here come to different conclusions, but if the reporting is correct that Iran, even after these strikes, still has centrifuges and still has enriched uranium and still has scientists who know how to put those things together, then it just is not true that the program has been obliterated. That is a program that can be reconstituted in a relatively short amount of time because, of course, knowledge is not able to be destroyed by bombs. The only way that you are going to make this country and this world safe from Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, and they have them, is diplomacy. I hope that diplomacy got easier because of these strikes, but I don't think they did. I don't think diplomacy got closer because of these strikes and whatever follow-on strikes may come as President Trump is currently threatening. And so if diplomacy is the only path, if you can't bomb out of existence knowledge, then I don't think this was a very good week for American national security. But I come to a different conclusion than many of my Republican colleagues do, even some of my Democratic colleagues. But Senator Kane's resolution is so important because that's the debate that we should be having. That's the argument that we should be having in public. That debate over the wisdom of dropping bombs in a far-off land that could put our troops at risk, that could drag us into a war, that's not a debate that the Founding Fathers thought that should take place behind closed doors at the Department of Defense, at the CIA, in the White House. That's actually the debate that they thought that this body should have, the United States Senate, that the House of Representatives should have. And that's the chance that we have today to bring that debate out of the shadows, out of the secret, to the place where the Founding Fathers thought it should exist. And that's why I urge my colleagues to support Senator Kane's resolution. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Trump's actions to address Iran's nuclear weapons program last weekend didn't start a war. They ended a war. And so I rise today to support President Trump's wisdom and leadership in decisively countering Iran's nuclear threat, and therefore to oppose this ill-conceived joint resolution. As United States Senator and former ambassador to Japan, I understand and respect the role that Congress plays in matters of war and peace. But I cannot, and I will not, support a resolution that removes the ability of the President of the United States to act decisively in defense of national interest, our allies, and our armed forces. This resolution, if passed, would send a dangerous message, not just to Iran's terrorist-sponsoring regime, but also to every adversary who's seeking to exploit our domestic debates and internal divisions. This resolution would signal that America's resolve can be hamstrung by congressional hesitation at the very moment when clarity, unity, and strength are most needed. I cannot state this strongly enough. President Trump acted entirely within his constitutional authority under Article 2 and in accordance with his solemn duty to defend this nation and to defend the American people. Operation Midnight Hammer was a targeted, strategic, and necessary use of force to eliminate immediate threats posed by the Iranian regime and its proxies. No American lives were lost or injured during this military operation, thanks to the leadership of President Trump, the advice and counsel of Vice President J.D. Vance, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and General Dan Kane, and the brilliant planning and flawless execution of the men and women of the United States Armed Forces. For decades, the Iranian regime has been attacking U.S. personnel, our allies, and our interest. Through its Revolutionary Guard, through Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthi terrorists, and through its missile programs and multiple cyber attacks. For decades, the Iranian regime has cynically violated international agreements to overtly and covertly pursue the capabilities necessary to make nuclear weapons on short notice. The idea that the president, in the face of escalating threats, can only sit idly by until Congress can hold hearings and schedule votes is not just naive, it's reckless. This war powers resolution ignores the reality of modern warfare, and it would constrain the commander-in-chief at the precise moment when decisiveness is most critical. It elevates process over common sense policy and political optics over operational necessity. If the president had been forced to act in accordance with this resolution last week, the element of surprise would have been entirely lost, and the successful mission flown by our brave airmen would have been much different and likely much costlier. Of course, Congress must be consulted. Of course, we can debate the scope and strategy of our military engagements, but we must not shackle our president in the middle of a crisis when lives are on the line. We must not embolden Ayatollahs in Tehran by showing division and delay, because that is the path to endless wars rather than the path to decisive victories. President Trump acted wisely and proportionately to protect American lives. He acted to reestablish the credibility of our strategic deterrence. And he acted after decades of Iranian aggression that went largely unanswered by the previous administrations of President Joe Biden and Barack Obama. President Trump once again demonstrated decisive leadership in the service of peace and stability. That is the actual job of the commander-in-chief. Let me conclude by repeating what I said at the start. President Trump's actions last weekend did not start a war. His actions ended a war, and not a single American life was lost. We should not be here debating how to constrain effective presidential leadership, but rather discussing how to recognize effective leadership and supporting it. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to oppose Senate Joint Resolution 59. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, thank you. The most significant responsibility and heavy burden the President has is the determination of when to engage the armed forces of our nation. Such decisions can both cost and save lives. This past Saturday, President Trump directed our military to respond to a growing threat that Iran could weaponize nuclear material and deliver a nuclear weapon. With escalating tensions between our ally Israel and our adversary Iran, the President made the decision to deter and delay the capabilities Iran has to deliver a nuclear weapon. What we know to date is from our intelligence sources that the President's actions were significant and successful. The United States Constitution splits the responsibility of the use of military force between legislative and executive branches. Having received a classified and thorough briefing from our military, intelligence, and diplomatic officials, I conclude that the President acted within his constitutional authorities. I welcome the return to a stricter constitutional balance of power between the branches of government. Under the circumstances of the recent actions of the President and the timing of the offering of the resolution now before the Senate, we should not adopt the resolution, which states in part, Congress hereby directs the President to terminate the use of United States armed forces for hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran, unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war. With the continuing threat from Iran against Israel, the dangers to American military men and women in the region, and because of the potential for terrorist acts upon U.S. interests within and without our borders, I believe the President has the constitutional authority and responsibility to defend the United States and its interests against imminent threats. I appreciate the President's decisive action and express gratitude and respect for the men and women of the military who carried out his orders, and I support the President in his efforts to find a peaceful resolution to hostilities in the region. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to speak prior to the scheduled vote. Senator Sanders for up to 10 minutes, Senator Graham for up to 10 minutes, Senator Risch for up to 10 minutes, Senator Kaine for up to 3 minutes, Senator Schumer for up to 3 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, everyone knows that our country faces enormous crises. We have a healthcare system that is broken and it is widely expensive. We have a housing crisis in which millions of people are spending far more than they can afford to put a roof over their heads. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, and a child care system which is dysfunctional. Millions of our kids cannot afford to go to college or are leaving school deeply in debt, and over 20% of our seniors are trying to get by on $15,000 a year or less. And oh, by the way, we have an existential threat in climate change, which might very well make the planet uninhabitable for future generations. These are just a few of the crises that Congress and the President should be addressing. Mr. President, in the midst of all of that, going to war against Iran and supporting Israel's unprovoked attacks against that country is not something that we should be doing. We do not need another unnecessary and costly war. We have had enough of them. Mr. President, in 1964, Congress voted with little debate for a Gulf of Tonkin resolution giving President Johnson the authority to escalate American military involvement in Vietnam. As a result, the U.S. expanded its presence in that country, and we were dragged fully into Vietnam's civil war. Eventually, some 2.7 million Americans served in Vietnam, and more than 58,000 died, and over 300,000 were wounded. The Vietnam War devastated an entire generation. It killed millions of Vietnamese, and it destabilized the region. It cost U.S. taxpayers hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Mr. President, the Vietnam War was based on a series of lies. Years later, the U.S. government concluded that the supposed attacks that prompted the Gulf of Tonkin resolution did not happen as reported. The so-called domino theory, the ideological foundation of that war, was bogus. That was a war that never should have been fought. Mr. President, in 2002, as a member of Congress, a new member of Congress, I can recall vividly how politicians and the media relentlessly beat the drum about the need to go to war against Iraq and its leader, Saddam Hussein. Over and over again, we were told that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction and that if we did not act quickly, nuclear weapons would be falling on America. Among those pushing for war in Iraq in 2002 were none other than Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who testified to Congress that, and I quote, "There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking nuclear weapons. If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you that it will have enormous positive reverberations," end quote. That was Netanyahu in 2002. The United States Congress, against my vote, invaded Iraq and became involved in a brutal sectarian war that lasted for almost a decade. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. That war was based on a lie that cost us 4,500 brave young Americans, 32,000 wounded, and $3 trillion in taxpayer dollars. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis also died. Mr. President, war often has awful and unintended consequences. It should only be considered as a last resort. We should not go to war against Iran. First, let me state the obvious. Trump's attack against Iran is unconstitutional. Congress alone has the authority to take this country into war, not the president. Trump does not have that authority. Second, Iran did not pose an imminent military threat to the United States that would justify a preemptive attack. Just a few months ago, Trump's own Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, testified to Congress that the American intelligence community, quote, continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003. End of quote from Tulsi Gabbard. Trump dismissed that finding, saying, quote, well then, my intelligence community is wrong, end of quote. Really? On what basis does he think that the entire United States intelligence community is wrong? Third, diplomacy offers a better path to durably address Iran's nuclear activities than a military attack. This was proven in 2015 when the United States and world powers made an agreement that strictly limited Iran's nuclear activities and put in place blanket inspections. That agreement was working, but Trump pulled out of that deal in 2018 and Iran restarted its activities. To his credit, Trump returned to diplomacy this year, and U.S. officials held 5 rounds of talks with Iran to address this issue. A 6th round of talks was scheduled for June 15th, but Israel derailed those talks with its surprise attack and, in the process, assassinated the Iranian official overseeing those negotiations. Fourth, Benjamin Netanyahu should not be dictating U.S. foreign and military policy. Trump's attack on Iran would not have occurred if Israel had not launched an illegal, unprovoked surprise attack on Iran on June 13th, sabotaging U.S. diplomatic efforts. If the people of Israel support Netanyahu's decision to start a war with Iran, that is their business, that is their war. The United States should not be part of it. Fifth, the United States should not be allied with the Netanyahu government in any military effort. Netanyahu is a war criminal indicted by the International Criminal Court for starving and killing civilians in Gaza. His government is systematically destroying the Palestinian people, killing over 55,000 and wounding nearly 130,000, 2/3 of whom are women and children. Israel has destroyed the entire physical infrastructure of Gaza, housing, hospitals, schools, and water systems, and continues to prevent the delivery of humanitarian aid to starving civilians in violation of U.S. and international law. 6, this war is about more than Israel and Iran. It is about the very concept of international law and preventing a world where every dispute is settled with force. Whatever you think of the brutal, authoritarian, and terrorist-supporting Iranian regime, Netanyahu's surprise attack was a clear violation of international law and the UN Charter. The world appropriately condemned Russia for its unprovoked attack against Ukraine. The world appropriately condemned Hamas for their unprovoked terrorist attack against Israel. Israel should be condemned for its unprovoked attack against Iran, and the United States should not be part of that illegal action. Finally, Mr. President, wars are expensive. We need funding to address the health care crisis, the child care crisis, the education crisis, and many other crises our people face every day. We should be investing our resources in improving life for the American people, not wasting money on illegal and unnecessary wars. Last year alone, the U.S. provided $22 billion in military aid to Israel. Enough is enough. It is beyond absurd that we continue to finance Israel's wars while neglecting the needs of our own people. Mr. President, for all these reasons, I strongly support Senator Kane's War Powers resolution to make clear that only Congress has the power to declare war, that there is no legal basis for war with Iran, and that the American people do not want more unnecessary, costly wars. Thank you.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much. This is a debate worthy of the body, and I would like to give my belief about what we're doing here, my opinion. Senator Kaine has introduced a resolution that basically require President Trump to come to the Congress before any other military actions could be taken against the Islamic Republic of Iran. I think that would be a disaster for the country. You can only have one commander-in-chief, not 535. Mr. President, you've been in it. You've been right close into the face of the enemy, and you probably above all others know what warfare is like dealing with radical Islam. And I applaud your service as a Navy SEAL. So it says in the Constitution, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militias of the several states when called into actual service in the United States. Well, they left out the Air Force because back then we didn't have one. Since the founding of this country, it's been understood that the Commander-in-Chief can act as the Commander-in-Chief to protect our nation from threats, that he is in charge of the military. He sits atop of he's the civilian in charge of the military, and it's his decision to use military force. It's Congress's decision to declare war. How many times do you think, Mr. President, we've declared war since the founding of our nation? I'll give you the answer. 5. Just think about all the military conflicts that have existed in the history of our country, and we've only declared war 5 times. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War against Spain, World War I, and World War II. So to my colleagues, if Congress has only declared war 5 times, does that mean all of these other military operations are illegal? No. That's ridiculous. Because we have the power to declare war, and us, the Congress only, doesn't mean the Commander-in-Chief can't be the Commander-in-Chief. This country cannot be put in a legal state of war unless the Congress decides to do that. But to suggest that means the Commander-in-Chief can't do anything without our approval makes all of us Commander-in-Chiefs. Do you think they had that in mind? Do you think they really meant for the Congress to be the Commander-in-Chief, not the Commander-in-Chief? The logic of this is as follows. Because we have the ability to declare war, therefore, the President can't act unless we agree. You've taken his power to be Commander-in-Chief away. The War Powers Act of 1973, referenced by Senator Sanders, is not worth, in my view, the paper it's written on. It was an effort by the Congress back then to limit President Nixon's involvement in the Vietnam War. The way you do that constitutionally is that Congress has the power of the purse. If we don't like what a president is doing in terms of military engagement, we can stop the funding for that engagement. But just think the chaos that would ensue in this country, that if there were not one commander-in-chief, but 535, and we had to sit down and talk among ourselves and debate as to whether or not we should go forward with the military operation in question, that would paralyze this country. And this leak of the Defense Intelligence Assessment tells you exactly what would happen if they brought this problem over to us to solve. So it's been clear to me that only 5 times in the history of the country have we declared war, and we've had hundreds of military operations that the founders never envisioned. The ability to declare war means the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, cannot act unless we agree, because that makes us the Commander-in-Chief, and that's not what they were trying to do. They were trying to make sure the country could not go into a legal situation involving war without the body as a whole making that decision. But when it comes to how to use the military and when to use the military, we have a single person who does that. That's the Commander-in-Chief, and that person can be limited by Congress's ability to cut off funding for military operations they don't approve of. So the War Powers Act, I think from its very founding, was unconstitutional. But this is a case study of the chaos that would be created if we accepted their version, the proponents' version of this. That President Trump would have to come to the Congress as a whole before he decided to strike the next nuclear facility that maybe we don't know about, or there's some imminent threat to our troops in the region. That's just not practical, and that's not what the founders meant. They put a single person in charge of the military, and that was the President of the United States. They made sure that going to war was a group decision. And in this country, we've used that process 5 times in 250 years. So not only did President Trump have the constitutional authority to engage in Operation Midnight Hammer, it was an incredible success. If you look up obliterate in the dictionary, it means to destroy utterly and wipe out. These 3 facilities were destroyed utterly and they were wiped out. They were obliterated. Now that doesn't mean that the threat from Iran is over. The desire of the regime still exists, and we'll have to deal with Iran down the road. But this vote, I think we all need to vote no, because what we're doing here, if we don't watch it, is having 535 commanders in chief that would paralyze this country. But something maybe we can agree on very quickly. Since the attack, the Iranian regime has gone on a terror campaign against their own people. They've arrested at least 700 people for ties to Israel. There have dozens of people been hanged, basically drug out of their houses and hanged. Iran turns to internal crackdown in wake of 12-day war. I will be doing a resolution condemning this regime's action. What they're doing is that they're trying to maintain power over their people after this attack. People in Iran are getting fed up with the Ayatollah. Instead of listening to the people and changing the behavior of the regime is engaged in a terror campaign of extrajudicial killings, imprisonment, and beatings to suppress the people. And I think this body and the civilized world should condemn what's going on in Iran right now. As to negotiations to solve the Iranian nuclear ambitions and to try to get a deal with Iran that we can all live with, count me in for that. But you got to remember the people you're negotiating with, as you talk to them, are killing their own people to try to keep them in control. And I've got one idea. Before we negotiate with Iran, they need to say one thing. We don't like Israel, we don't agree with Israel, but we recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist. The policy of the Iranian regime is to destroy the state of Israel, purify Islam, and come after us, the infidels. Until they change that policy, nothing's really going to work. So what I want to hear before we sit down and talk to the Ayatollah and his henchmen is that for the first time ever since the founding of the Iranian regime, they recognize Israel's right to exist. Is that too much to ask? Finally, this is the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. 80 years ago, this past month, the Nazis surrendered, and one of the hallmarks of the Nazi regime was to kill all the Jews. 80 years later, we're having a debate about a regime that wants a nuclear weapon to kill all the Jews, and we're wondering what to do. You know what we should do? We should make sure they can't kill all the Jews. We could make sure that this homicidal maniac, the Ayatollah, who's a religious Nazi, is not allowed to get a nuclear weapon and rain havoc on the region and come after us. It's hard to believe that 80 years later we would be having this debate. What should we do? To my good friend, Senator Sanders, your solution will lead to World War III. You will appease evil. And World War II happened because people like Senator Sanders did not stand up to Hitler. They did not choose wisely. They did not stop him when they could. And that's exactly what's going on now. Until this religious Nazi regime gives up their desire to destroy the state of Israel, to wreak havoc on the region, and to come after us, chanting death to America, then we should stand up to them. I'm not advocating invading Iran, but I am advocating being tough, no sanctions relief, and don't reward this behavior. Vote no to Senator Kane's proposal. Stand up for the Constitution as it's been implemented for over 250 years. And all of us pray for the Iranian people and for our friends in Israel that better days are ahead. But these better days only come with sacrifice. And as I speak, people in Iran are sacrificing because they just want to live free. I yield.
Don't use it, Maya. Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I rise today to oppose this unhelpful resolution. It's a clear attempt to take a slap at President Trump and nothing more. President Trump's foreign policy successes have been several and should be celebrated, not denigrated. For instance, recently his work when India and Pakistan started fighting, he got involved and he had that shut down pretty quickly. This morning, I had the good fortune to attend with Secretary Rubio an event at the State Department where a peace agreement was signed between Rwanda and the Congo. Both Rwanda and the Congo were effusive in their compliments of President Trump for negotiating the peace that happened. So the president's been hard at work trying to be the president of peace that he really wants to be. First, I think that we ought to have a good statement from the administration as to why this resolution is not well taken. And I'm going to quote from the Executive Office of the President, their statement on the policy. Senate Joint Resolution 59 fails to account for the dynamic security threat posed by Iran and its proxies, and our commitments to force protection in the region. On June 12th, the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors found that Iran had failed to comply with its nuclear safeguards obligations. Iran immediately responded, stating that it would establish a new uranium enrichment facility in a secure location and that other measures were being planned. Israel took action against Iran, an action it believed was necessary for its self-defense. The United States' top priority is protecting American forces in the region. President Trump will take all necessary steps to protect our forces, de-escalate conflict, and remain in close contact with our regional partners. Senate Joint Resolution 59 should be rejected also because it purports to limit the President's Article II authority under the Constitution and could hinder the President's ability in his constitutional role as Commander-in-Chief to protect the United States from the continued threat posed by Iran and its proxies. Senate Joint Resolution 59 also could hinder the President's ability to protect the United States forces in the region through actions to de-escalate the threat posed by Iran and its proxies. The operative part of this resolution that's before us states, quote, Congress hereby directs the President to terminate the use of United States armed forces from hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran. This might be appropriate if we were at war against Iran, or indeed if there were hostilities against Iran, but we are not, and we do not intend to. You can't terminate something that's not going on. Every American is opposed to the long, drawn-out conflicts that we have in our history from time to time experienced. I assure you that President Trump feels exactly the same way. He hates those long, drawn-out conflicts. He hates any kind of kinetic action, but realizes that as Commander-in-Chief, he has to take them at times. The President did take a single strike against Iran at carefully calculated targets and in an even more carefully calculated time, much like what he did with General Soleimani in his first term that was so successful. The strike on Iran was a single brief strike at 3 nuclear bomb facilities that ended the conflict between Israel and Iran. It was on behalf of a close ally, Israel, and on behalf of the world, which is unanimously against Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon. Most importantly, it ended a war. It did not start a war. If the U.S. or Donald Trump or any other president sought to declare war on Iran, this would be well taken. The Constitution is clear that only this body, the Congress of the United States, can declare war. But the Constitution and statutes are equally clear that the president not only may, but must act to defend America and Americans at a time or place that a threat presents itself. Congress has also spoken on the power of the president in the War Powers Act. Now, we've heard a lot on the floor today about how important the Founding Fathers thought declaration of war was. They were absolutely right. It is just as right today as it was then. There's a lot of difference between then and now. Then we had oceans protecting us on each side, and for a war to take place, it took months to unfold and to start. In today's world, it's a press of a button, and it happens instantaneously. That's why Congress went in and passed the War Powers Act that gave the president the opportunity to defend America. And in that act, it provided things that the president had to do. He complied with that act exactly as it was put in place by Congress when he took the Single Strike Act against Iran. Also, the Justice Department has opined to Republican and Democrats presidents and created a precedent as to when the president could use power. This strike is in full compliance with that guidance. The guidance is very simple. Number one, if the president is going to take action, it must, one, be in a national interest, and number two, be limited in nature, scope, and duration. And of course, that's further modified by the action that Congress has taken in the War Powers Act. What this president did with this single strike was in full compliance with the Constitution and statutes. Both open source reporting and the classified briefing we received demonstrated this was a brilliant tactical move, which was brilliantly planned and executed after in-depth conversations with the intelligence community and the talented array of presidential advisors that President Trump has. My colleague on the other side of the aisle should do what we on our side of the aisle have been doing, and that is congratulate the president and the brave men and women who conceived and executed this spectacularly successful event and thank them, and recognize that this ended the conflict between Israel and Iran. Instead, what we have seen is an attempt in every way to denigrate the action, downplay it, and berate this great and glorious victory. This resolution that we have before us today is another sad attempt in that regard. I understand that the hate and vitriol against our president precipitates this kind of thinking. It's wrong. This is ill-conceived and will telegraph that we Americans do not stand with our president or with Israel. That is also wrong. Make no mistake, Iran is all alone in this. No one is coming to help them. This body, above all, should not be the entity that provides aid and comfort to Iran. I urge a no vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
The remaining two speakers, Senator Schumer has yielded his time to me. I will be the last speaker before the vote. My colleague from Idaho says this is driven by hate and vitriol. Tell President Trump he well knows that from my first months in the Senate, I have taken this position now against 4 presidents, Democratic and Republican. The principles that have been stated on this floor about the Constitution and War Powers Resolution are very, very clear. Congress declares war. Once declared, the president is the commander-in-chief. There is no war without a declaration of Congress. The president as commander-in-chief can defend the United States against imminent attack, but there was no such imminent threat posed by the Iranian nuclear program, as the president's own national security advisor testified to Congress shortly before this strike, and as the Israeli foreign minister announced before the U.S. strike that the Israeli actions had set the nuclear program back 2 or 3 years. No imminent attack on the United States, no imminent threat. That means Congress gets to declare war. This is not about hatred for any president. It is about standing up and doing what we took an oath to do. My colleague from South Carolina says we've only declared war 5 times, ending with World War II. That's not accurate. Congress has had the guts to at least vote on authorizing war up through 2002. But in 2002, something happened, Mr. President, in this body. The Senate and the House got lied into a war with bogus intelligence about the weapons program of the nation of Iraq. We should be haunted by that. We should be haunted by that. The claims that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction led us into a war where thousands of troops and thousands of U.S. contractors were killed. And so what should have been the learning that came out of that we should do a good job kicking the tires as Congress before we go into a war and not get lied into a war. Instead, Mr. President, what I fear, since there's been no willingness of Congress to vote on any war since 2002, is what members of this body have decided is, wow, we got it wrong. We were lied into a war. We voted in a way that we regretted. So let's not vote at all. Let's not vote at all. Let's overturn the congressional and constitutional history that says we only go to war with Congress and try to hide in the grass. Many of my colleagues have said things about Iran and how bad Iran is. None of them have ever introduced an authorization for war against Iran. If Iran is so bad, do that. People in this body would rather not vote so they can't be held accountable. I get that. That's a human impulse. It's just a human impulse that so disrespects the service of our men and women in uniform. If we're going to send troops into harm's way, our sons and daughters, whether they're flying bombing missions or ground troops or covert operations, we ought to have the guts in this body to cast a vote saying that that war is necessary. Not just act as cheerleaders and hide from culpability, hide from accountability, hide from responsibility. If you vote against Senate Joint Resolution 59, what you are saying is this president should be able to wage war without coming to Congress. If you think the president should have to come to Congress, whether you're for or against a war in Iran, you'll support Senate Joint Resolution 59. You'll support the Constitution that has stood the test of time. You'll support your oath. I urge a positive vote on the resolution, and I yield back.
Question occurs on the motion to discharge S.J. Res. 59.
I'd ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Marino, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Blunt Rochester, Cantwell, Coons, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Murray, Padilla, Paul, Schumer, Smith, and Warner. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Fetterman, Marino, Mullen, Risch, Sheehy, Tillis, and Tuberville. Ms. Alsobrooks, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Ricketts, no. Mr. Grassley? No. Mrs. Moody? No. Mrs. Britt? No. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Marshall? No. Mr. Lujan? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Graham? No. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Hawley? No. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Budd? No. Mr. McConnell? No. Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mrs. Capito? No. Mr. Langford? No. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Cassidy? No. Mr. Schmidt? No. Ago, aye. Mr. Schiff, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Young, no. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Justice, no. Mr. Haggerty, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. Husted, no. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Curtis, no. Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Welch, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Banks, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. McCormick, no. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 47, the nays are 53, and the motion is not agreed to.
President.
I recognize the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. President. The first time I did that, I left it like that, and the floor staff.
Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Oregon.
are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've come to the floor to talk about debt and the challenge that confronts us. Over the last few decades, we've seen a lot of sources of red ink. Among them are the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. We saw the first Bush tax bill in 2001, massive red ink. 2003, massive red ink. Trump's tax bill in 2017, an ocean of red ink. I don't think anyone here would argue that these decisions didn't result in significant deficits and significant additions to the debt. And yet there's so much conversation here about fiscal responsibility and let's get this under control. And yet we see time and time again this body vote under Republican leadership for another ocean of red ink, another massive deficit, adding to an already bloated debt that so profoundly compromises the ability of our nation to address issues in the next generation. We're borrowing from the next generation, making it less likely that we can effectively provide the programs, the foundation of healthcare and housing and education and the investment in R&D that produces good paying jobs for the next generation to thrive. That's wrong. It is wrong to proceed to borrow and compromise the next generation in order to give tax breaks to billionaires. Wow. You know, there's purposes for when we do need to borrow, when we're facing a recession, when we're facing a war. But we haven't been in a recession. We haven't been at war, although we clearly had an attack on Iran, and maybe we are at war now, maybe not. We'll see if the ceasefire holds. But we're not in a position yet where we should be proceeding to say this current year we should be creating even more deficits. But the bill before us doesn't create this massive new additional ocean of red ink for the purpose of addressing a war, nor to address a recession, but instead for the lofty purpose of enriching the richest Americans. I must say that driving 16 million people off of health care to give tax breaks to mega millionaires and billionaires may make the mega millionaires and billionaires who are serving in this chamber quite happy. But it doesn't make America better. I must say that leaving 4 million children hungry does devastating impact on their ability to study and learn and thrive in their lives to come. And to do it for tax breaks for billionaires may make my colleagues who are really rich really happy. But it's really wrong. And in addition, my colleagues just aren't creating a sea of debt. They're also tearing down the bipartisan structure designed for Congress to exercise discipline over deficits and debt. That architecture was crafted in 1974. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act, normally referred to as the Budget Act, 1974 Act. And it came about because two things were going on. One is that President Nixon had impounded funds, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. You can't steal the power of the purse. In the Constitution, that power of the purse is given to Congress. And senators were very concerned about the deficits that were existing in 1971 and 72 and 73. They averaged $20 billion a year. They totaled $60 billion. Well, I can tell you that now, when our deficit's running at something closer to $2 trillion a year, $20 billion doesn't sound like much of a cause for alarm. But that's how determined 100 senators were to get control over our budgeting process. All 100 voted for this structure, the Budget Control Act, and it had two basic features. It had a regular budgeting process, and then for legislation that reduced the deficit, it had a special fast-track, filibuster-free lane called reconciliation. But you could only use it for reducing the deficit. That special, fast-track, filibuster-free lane really meant a lot here in the Senate because we're the ones that have the 60-vote requirement. The House doesn't have a requirement for 60 votes for 3/5 of the body on anything. So it was really all about here, about the Senate's sense that we should only drop the 60 votes for bills that reduce the deficit. And embedded in this were three fundamental provisions, three pillars of the architecture of getting control of deficits and debt. The first was, in the first 10 years that are presented in a reconciliation bill, the sum of the 10 years has to produce deficit reduction. That was pillar number one. The second pillar was that in every single year that follows the first 10, it has to produce deficit reduction. It has to save money. And the third was honest numbers. We're going to use honest numbers. We're going to create this organization, Congressional Budget Office, and we're going to utilize it to cost out programs and do the modeling, be nonpartisan. And then we're going to utilize this other organization that already existed, the Joint Committee on Taxation, to have their staff produce honest, nonpartisan numbers for the cost of revenue provisions. And the section of the law that controls this special reconciliation process says each provision, whether for a spending program or for revenue, has to be costed out in order to be able to hold ourselves accountable. If the provision is written down and it changes the law, how much will that cost? If the provision is not in the law, not in the proposed law, then obviously that's different than if the provision is in the law. New law versus existing law. That's what Section 313 says is going to be costed out to see if we're meeting the goals laid out in the budget resolution. That's the discipline. So those were the three things. No deficits created in the first 10 years. Second, no deficits created in any year following the first 10 years. And third, honest numbers about what each provision costs. Those are the three things. Well, that was in 1974. You can picture Robert Byrd, who was a passionate defender of the 60-vote requirement. But he voted for this special fast-track, filibuster-free, for that one purpose, reducing deficits. So that was 1974. Well, 22 years later, along comes a moment when you have a Republican Senate and a Republican House. And the Republicans said, you know what? We'd like this idea of a line item veto. So they passed it. Fine, but the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional because the Constitutional says the power of the purse lies with Congress, not with the President. Something that our current Office of Management and Budget and our Director of Management and Budget doesn't like and is contesting and told me he wants the Supreme Court to overrule what it ruled back then. The second idea was to do a balanced budget amendment. But the Republican chair of Appropriations stood up and said, you know what? Sometimes you need to spend more because of conflict. Sometimes you need to spend more because of recession. And so, no, we shouldn't have a formulistic formula, and he refused to vote for it. And the proposal failed, one vote short of the 67 it needed. Okay, but then the Republican majority said, but we know this, got this other idea. We've got all these really rich and powerful corporations and individuals, and we want to give them a massive, beautiful tax cut and make them even more richer and powerful. And they will love us, and they will keep us in power. What a win-win to give away the treasury to the richest people in this country. But they had a problem. There was no filibuster-free fast track that allowed creating a deficit. So what did they do? They fired the parliamentarian. That's what they did. They brought in a new parliamentarian, a parliamentarian who had actually been on the parliamentarian team back in 1974, a parliamentarian who had then left that parliamentarian team and gone to work for the majority leader, and then came back off the majority leader's staff to rule and say, that deal that was crafted with all 100 senators, we're going to break that deal. We're going to do a nuclear option. We're going to blow it up. And we're going to say that this fast track can be used to create deficits in the first 10 years. So there went Pillar 1. Pillar 2 has survived until now, until this moment. No deficits after the first 10 years. Pillar 3, use honest numbers, has survived until now. Use the CBO numbers. Use the comparison of a provision as described in Section 313 and honestly relay what it costs for a program or for a revenue provision. And I say until now because my colleague, who I love to work with on a number of things, has an idea. And he said, there is a provision, not in the section of the law that exists for reconciliation, but in the section of the law that deals with just the regular budget process that was created in 1974, that gives the budget chair some flexibility to solve technical problems. And I think I can use that to simply decree a new baseline so that things that actually cost a ton of money, we can tell the American people and ourselves they don't cost money. Well, let's see. Here are some examples. The business pass-through. Joint Committee on Taxation, pass-through for LLCs, says this provision in the law will cost $736 billion. My good friend across the aisle, who says, I want to use a magic baseline to show things cost less, he says, we'll use a technique here, some magic math, and tell the people that only costs $6 billion, even though Joint Committee on Taxation tells us it costs $736 billion. Let's reduce it to less than 1% of the true cost. Well, let's take another example. There's a provision that extends the estate and gift tax exemptions. The honest broker, Joint Committee on Taxation, says putting that provision in the bill will cost, as in increasing deficits and increasing the debt, $212 billion. But my colleague across the aisle says, I want to tell people it doesn't really cost that. It only costs $10 billion by using my baseline as opposed to the honest baseline that we have used ever since 1974 passed, when 100 senators said, let's stop using smoke and mirrors and let's use honest numbers. Or how about the exemptions being expanded for the alternative minimum tax? The cost of that from the Joint Committee on Taxation, $1.37 trillion. That's with a T, trillion. $1.37 trillion. My good colleague across the aisle says, using my magic math and my special baseline, that won't increase the deficit, it'll actually reduce the deficit by $6 billion. Are you kidding me? We're going to destroy the principle that for 51 years we will use honest numbers with ourselves and honest numbers with the American people. And in the process, we're tearing down that second pillar, that reconciliation will never be used to extend deficits past the reconciliation window of 10 years. Because you see, that's never been allowed by either party. Never done it. In fact, the ruling in 1996, the one that tore down it can only be used for deficits in the first 10 years, that ruling was explicit in reaffirming the second pillar, no deficits after 10 years. So we have the plain language of the law. We have 51 years of precedent. We have the ruling from 1996. But my colleague says, I want to use magic math to pretend this bill doesn't cost what it costs. Well, let's take a closer look at the provision that my colleague, chair of the Budget Committee, is using. It's called Section 312. Let's see how it's been used. Let's see if it's ever been used on reconciliation. Let's see if it's ever been used completely on the breadth of an entire reconciliation bill. Let's start by asking the question, has it ever been used in a partisan way? Well, in 2017, Crime Victims Fund, oh no, bipartisan decision. 2023-25, Power Marketing Administration, bipartisan. They were solving a technical issue. Both parties worked on it together. Preventing double counting of a dairy program, bipartisan. Adjustment to Fiscal Responsibility Act, bipartisan. It's become traditional to say this power in Section 312 rests with the chair of the Budget Committee, but that's not true. The law says it rests with the Budget Committee. The reason we think of it as resting with the chairman is because it's always been done in a bipartisan way, with the Democrats and Republicans together saying we're solving a problem. Second question, has it ever been used on the breadth of a reconciliation bill or only upon a narrow provision? Well, turns out in every single case, the Crime Victims Fund, the Power Marketing, the Dairy Program, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, always a narrow provision, but not now. How else can we take a look at this? How about if we look at whether it was resolving a technical ambiguity? Yep, every single time, resolving a technical problem, bipartisan fashion, narrow provision. And most importantly, has this provision of 312, which is not in the section that controls reconciliation, ever been used in reconciliation? Nope. Not in 2017, not in 2023 through 25, not on the Dairy Program, not on the Fiscal Responsibility Act, not ever. Never used in reconciliation. So, colleagues, two big issues are here. Are you really going to vote for a bill that causes over $3 trillion in debt over 10 years compared to current law? Are you really going to vote for a bill, a reconciliation bill, that for the first time continues that Red Sea in years 11 through 30, 30 years out, extending beyond the 10-year window, in direct violation of the ruling of the parliamentarian in 1996, in direct violation of a section of 313 that says that only you cannot run deficits after that? You know, those 30-year estimates over $30 trillion of additional debt from this bill. Now, our current debt is pretty high, $37 trillion. This adds another 30-plus trillion, and the Congressional Budget Office costed out what happens if the interest rates are 1% higher than they put in their model, 1% higher. And of course, it's easy to imagine that we could be off by 1%. 1% higher, and the cost isn't 30 trillion, it's closer to 60 trillion. 1% higher, of additional debt over 30 years. They said it would add another $24 trillion on top of the over $32 trillion to begin with. Are you really going to vote for a bill that uses dishonest numbers? So here's one reason to vote against this bill. It's massive debt creator, primarily to give tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans. Here's the second reason. It tears down programs in health care and nutrition that are key to the success of our children and families who are in the 20% less affluent in America. Here's a third reason. It creates debt far into the future, beyond the 10-year window, that will compromise the ability of us to address the challenges of America for decades and decades to come. It's really an attack on the next generation. Here's a fourth reason. It tears down the framework of accountability, the last two standing pillars, crafted by 100 senators, all voting yes in 1974. I encourage my colleagues, as they get together in their caucuses on the blue side of the aisle or the red side of the aisle, to say, let's hold on. This is wrong. This is not what the president campaigned on. He campaigned on being a champion for families, not for billionaires. To screw over families, to make the rich richer. Wow, just that extension of the alternative minimum tax that's going to cost $1,368,932,000,000. Oh wow, in other words, almost $1.4 trillion. And what ordinary family uses an exemption under the alternative minimum tax? It's the mega wealthy. That's not, they listed it under Chapter 1, which they titled Tax Relief for Middle-Class Families. Find me a middle-class family in which this alternative tax exemption applies. So, we are just days away from voting on this. We're going through the bird bath in which different policies are examined, and if they're primarily a policy, they're not allowed in here. That was part of the rules that were crafted long ago for the special fast-track reconciliation. Then we have 20 hours of debate, and then we have amendments. We are very close to the point of making this tragic mistake. And I know that many of my new colleagues who are just recently sworn in January have been folks who said we need fiscal discipline. You can't campaign on fiscal discipline and tell your constituents you're going to uphold that after you take office and then come here and not only vote for this massive debt, but tear down at the same time the last two pillars of the architecture for controlling deficits this year and into the future. That isn't square, so don't do it. Mr. President, I'll close by saying this is not the first time we've been down this road. And there's a few myths that people tell themselves to justify this. We'll only do this once. 2001 was once. 2003 was twice. 2017 was the third time. We're doing the same damn thing again, mortgaging our future and helping increase wealth inequality in this country by doing all these special provisions for really rich people. We've done it now. This is the fourth time. Don't pretend you're fooled like you didn't get it, because we've been down this road before. It is the wrong road. Families lose, billionaires win. It's the wrong mission for America. It's the wrong mission for the U.S. Senate. The right mission is families thrive and billionaires pay their fair share. Thank you, Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Oregon. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
I recognize the majority leader.
Mr. President, I understand there's a bill that, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand there's a bill at the desk, and I ask for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 1, an act to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Title II of H. Con Res 14.
Mr. President, I now ask for a second reading, and in order to place the bill on the calendar under the provisions of Rule 14, I object to my own request.
Objection is heard. The bill will be read for the second time on the next legislative day.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it stand adjourned until 2 p.m. on Saturday, June 28th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal proceedings be approved today, the time for the two leaders be reserved for use later in the day, and the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.